Would you like to say a word of welcome on behalf of the...
Yeah, I'm Sonia Michelle, Director of United States Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'm a co-organizer along with Roger and Christian Osterman of the European Studies program of this event. And as a recovering historian, I'm always glad to participate in things that bring more history events to the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center, as most of you know, is a place that is designed to bring together scholars and policymakers, and this series is particularly welcome because it really emphasizes the history part of and the scholarly part of that partnership, but of course with an eye toward policy all the time. So we're very pleased to have our speaker with us today, and we look forward to this event, and welcome to everybody.
And let us begin as we usually do. It's becoming a sort of ritual. If we just go around the table and let us know who you are and what your affiliation is. If you don't have an affiliation, just say to hell with affiliations.
Or make one up.
Steve.
My name is Steve Galpern. I'm a Palestinian affairs analyst at the U.S. Department of State and a historian in my spare time.
And author of a recently published book, title of which?
Money, Oil, and Empire in the Middle East, published by Cambridge University Press.
I'm Ken McDonald. I'm a retired civil servant. I used to work for a research organization in Langley, Virginia.
I'm Chandler McDonald. I'm at State Department, and I'm with him.
I'm Red Austin, and this is Nancy Austin. We haven't said to hell to affiliation, but I can't find one that'll take it.
Sam
Wells at the center.
Sherry Wells. I'm a historian at GW University, and I teach history of the European Union.
Bart Hacker. I'm a curator of military history at the American History Museum across the street.
Margaret Vining. I'm a curator of military history at the National Museum of American History.
Ben Gooderman, editor at the National Archives.
Don Wolfensberger, director of the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center.
Tony Alcott, I'm in the Institute for Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown, and I have some affiliation with research organizations.
Todd Leventhal, I work in public diplomacy at the Department of State.
Tom Dell, formerly with DOD.
Holly Galley, graduate student at Georgetown. Megan Delaney, I'm with the International Health Division for DOD.
I'm Dane Kennedy, History Department at GW.
Shelton Guerin, History Department at Princeton. Center.
Magdalena Gala, University of Rome 3. An Italian scholar.
Terry Lutz, public policy scholar at the Center and a China historian.
I'm Asha Feldman.
I'm Kathleen Friedel. I teach at UC Berkeley in the History Department, and I'm also a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Steve Lagerfeld, editor of the Wilson Quarterly.
Graduate.
I'm Marty Sherwin. I'm a fellow at the Center and a historian.
Miriam Cunningham with the National History Center.
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the Center.
I'm Erin Chapman. I'm a student at Indiana University, and I'm a research assistant here.
Matt LaChance with the Department of the Army.
Linda Miller.
Eugene Rogan, as I believe everyone knows, is the director of the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He is an American, despite the Oxford appointment. He has recently published a book about the history of the Arabs, and there was a little confusion about the announcement, because some of you read the announcement as Eugene Rogan relating the history of the West through Arab eyes. And so Eugene immediately sent a correction that this is the history of the Arabs through Arab eyes. And I said, well, come on, Eugene, why don't you expand the topic? So it just goes to show that the director of the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College is a very good sport. And he has agreed to tell us this afternoon about the history of the West through Arab eyes, as well as the history of the Arabs through Arab eyes. Eugene Rogan.
Now, if any of you feel compelled to leave at this point because of false advertising, I want you to know I'm not going to be offended.
There's something about a St. Anthony's education that teaches one to roll with the punches, and Roger Lewis would know better than I. The West through Arab eyes, that would be a very short lecture. So I might revert to what it was that motivated me to address 5 centuries of modern Arab history. And I guess the first question that you have to ask before taking on such a daunting prospect is, does the world really need another book on the history of the Arabs? I went to the Oxford University Library System's online catalog and found that there were no fewer than 16 books that share my title, The Arabs. Some of them in many editions, it's true, but there were no fewer than 7 or 8 really illustrious authors who've written books called The Arabs. H.A.R. Gibb did the first one in 1940, Bertram Thomas, R.B. Sargent, Edward Atiyah, Harry Ellis, E.C. Hodgkin, Peter Mansfield, and Maxime Rodinson. Penguin makes an industry out of this title. Mine is the 4th Penguin book published with the title The Arabs. But OUP's done no fewer than 2. So between Penguin and Oxford, I am well represented here. That's part of the problem. Do we need another one? And then the other one is, of course, the antecedents. Besides those books that are called The Arabs, because not all of them really were tackling history. A lot of them were looking at the current state of the Arab world at that time. But there are certainly a couple of outstanding general histories of the Arab world, my favorite being my predecessor, Albert Hourani, whose History of the Arab Peoples already avoids one of the main pitfalls that I fall straight into by recognizing the diversity of the Arab peoples, how there is not an Arab nation, but many Arab nations, not an Arab culture, but many Arab cultures. And for those of us who studied the modern Arabic language and have tried to move with our Fusha from Morocco to Oman, you learn there are many Arabic languages. So I think Albert got that one absolutely right. He also had the distinction of becoming a New York Times bestseller. The first time the illustrious Harvard University Press ever had one of its books make it onto the New York Times bestseller, he went right up to number 2, thanks to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. Stopped from the number 1 slot, appropriately enough for this building, by Kitty Kelly's biography of Nancy Reagan. I remember visiting Albert in his home in London, and among all the titles on his bookshelves from Middle Eastern related topics, there was Kitty Kelly's biography of Nancy Reagan, and it stood out like a sore thumb. But he said he had to see what was the book that had kept him from number 1. The other book that I really love, and again has the kind of From the Rise of Islam to Modern Times about it, is Philip Hitty's book. And I believe it's still in print. That book first came out in the 1930s. So you've got great antecedents, you've got a lot of books called The Arabs, and then you have looming over your shoulder the specter of Edward Said, raising all sorts of doubts at our hubris of even trying to take on such a thing as write a history of the Arabs, by asking whether there's any way in the world that a Westerner can write the history of the other without bringing the baggage of domination with you. It was true of those who approached the history of the Arab world from Britain and France during the colonial period, and America's presence in the Middle East today means that there is a certain baggage that any American scholar is going to bring to the study of the Arabs, and there's no point in trying to deny it. But the question is, should it stop you? Is it so much of an impediment that you can't get over it? I guess my short answer to all my questions, by virtue of the book being out, is that I thought another history was needed, and that it could be done. Why was it needed? Well, I think that the Arab world is sufficiently important in geostrategic terms. It consumes so much of the news agenda that there will be a demand for a timely and up-to-date survey of that part of the world for sort of each generation. I think the reading public will always be looking for a modern history of the Arabs. And for all their virtues, Hitty's book, written in the 30s, was as close to Islamic reformer Muhammad Abduh as you and I are to the legacy of Anwar Sadat. You know, to him, recent history is really quite old history for us. Hourani's book was completed just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so hadn't really brought in any of the post-Cold War perspective that I think readers today would bring to the question of how did we get to where we are today. So I think that there's a need for a book that addresses the place of the contemporary Arab world in a post-Cold War world and in a post-9/11 world. The events of 9/11 and subsequent attacks in Madrid in 2004 and in London in 2005 were certainly very important driving factors that made me drop the Ottoman history. I was actually writing a book about the Damascus Christian massacres in 1860. I was working in Damascus on 9/11 when the events happened. But it just seemed to me that it was a time in which perhaps scholars needed to be engaging with the broader public and the broader pool of ideas. And so I think those events proved very influential in driving me to think about writing a broader type of history than I'd done before. Why? Because almost overnight, people in the United States and in Europe came to see the greatest threat to their peace, their security, and their way of life as lying in the Arab world specifically and the Muslim world more generally. Now, as we all know, Britain and the US led a series of responses which they called the War on Terrorism, the heightened tensions between the West and the Muslim world. These range from relatively benign measures like raising visa restrictions, which made it difficult for visitors as students. They clamped down on the flow of funding. There was greater cooperation between research institutes in Langley and other agencies in other countries, but none of which really had much of an impact on the lives of people in the Muslim world in general. But the other side of it were more intrusive measures. And the War on Terror saw war on states, Afghanistan, Iraq, saw armed incursions into countries as remote as Yemen and as Pakistan, that all brought a militarized Western presence to the very heart of the Arab world and the Middle East. Countries like the UK and the US that had once really set the standard for international human rights and the rule of law were accused now of torture in facilities that they had in Bagram, in Guantanamo. And in allied countries that were known to practice torture, we extended the practice by extraordinary rendition. The war on terrorism also led America to turn a blind eye to violence by states like Israel or Russia against their Muslim opponents, whether it was the Chechens, who were seeking a separate existence for their statehood, the Shiite militia Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Hamas militia in Gaza. Though these groups had nothing in common with the global jihad pursued by Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization, these armed Muslim nationalist movements were conflated with the West's war on terror. So no criticisms were leveled against states fighting terrorism, regardless of the civilian casualties inflicted or the disproportionate use of the violence. This is not an exercise in trying to make Westerners feel badly about themselves, but what it meant is that for people from the Arab and the Islamic world, the war on terrorism, the first decade of the 21st century, proved to be the period of greatest tension in modern Arab history. I surveyed 5 centuries. I can't find a decade to match it. And what people in the West couldn't understand was by these measures I just outlined, people in the Arab world came to see Americans in particular, and Westerners generally, as the greatest threat to their peace, to their security, and their way of life. So the best way I could think of trying to bridge this gap of mutual miscomprehension was to try and write a book that explained modern Arab history as it's been experienced by the Arabs through the eyes of Arab contemporaries themselves. In this I was inspired by a wonderful book by a Lebanese journalist named Amin Maalouf. It's called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. I thought that there was something in his approach to the sensitive subject of the Crusades, another example of when people from the West and the Islamic world viewed each other across a chasm of mutual misunderstanding, mutual fear and loathing. Maalouf wrote in his introduction, the basic idea of this book is simply to tell the story of the Crusades as they were seen, lived, and recorded on the other side. In other words, in the Arab camp. Its content is based almost exclusively on the testimony of contemporary Arab historians and chroniclers. I don't know if any of you have ever read this book. It's a popular history. but it came out in the early 80s. It's been around a while. But when I read it, it made the Crusades come alive for me as a non-specialist reader in a way that few books had. It just gave you an immediacy of personal experience of those who were eyewitnesses to the Crusades from the Arab perspective that I thought was very powerful. And I thought this would be something worth trying to replicate for our own times. Malouf's approach to the study of the Crusades could not be more relevant to the needs of Western readers towards the history of the Arab world today. All too often in the West, people tend to discredit or be dismissive of the present relevance of history. To say something's history in our culture is often to dismiss it as being irrelevant. But obviously that's not true. Malouf argued in his book that the Crusades remain a source of tension between the Arabs and Europe. Just witness the reaction in the Arab world when President George W. Bush described the conflict that we were embarking on as a crusade. Had Bush had a better sense of the present relevance of the Crusades to an Arab audience, he most certainly would have chosen a better turn of phrase to try and capture what he was launching. The present relevance of history does not stem from a belief that history in some way repeats itself, but rather through knowing our history, we, the general public, our leaders, our policymakers, might actually avoid making historic mistakes and repeating historic mistakes. And in the introduction of the book, I give one of my favorite examples of common Western historical mistake that we've recently just walked into again. It's this trope of describing the actions of invading Western armies as liberations. I cite the first example of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. This was the first Western army to reach the Eastern Mediterranean since the Crusaders had left, so it sort of continues with our earlier theme here. As Napoleon arrived, he issued a proclamation to the people of Egypt, declaring that he had come to liberate them from the tyranny of the Mamluks. These were feuding households who had been the kind of militias that ran Ottoman Egypt. Napoleon professed the French Republic's respect for Islam and its values, and called on the people of Egypt to welcome the French as liberators. It was the original Hearts and Minds campaign, and it failed. Fortunately, we have a very eloquent record of one of Napoleon's contemporaries, an intellectual by the name of Jabarti, who left a very detailed critique of Napoleon's proclamation to the people of Egypt, which, after he's, like a pedant, finished correcting all the grammatical mistakes, concludes that Napoleon was suffering from a derangement of the mind. The Egyptians in 1798 recognized the French invasion for what it was, an exercise of power and domination. But General Stanley Maude repeated Napoleon's mistake when he led the British occupation of Baghdad in March of 1917 at the height of the First World War. This was one of the first British victories in the battlefield after the deadlock in the Western Front and the defeats it experienced already in the Ottoman front. The British, Maude claimed, had come to liberate the people of Iraq from the tyranny of strangers, his quote, citing a long list of foreign occupiers going right back to the Mongols who sacked Baghdad in 1258, and leading up through history to the current Ottoman state. The British, he claimed, had no interest in Iraq except the welfare of its people and would help them to achieve self-rule in the post-war settlement. Noble sentiments, except for the fact that, of course, the British government had already declared its strategic interests in Mesopotamia and had already concluded agreements with the French and the Russians on the post-war partition of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman world that put Mesopotamia very squarely under British dominion. In other words, Maude's proclamations notwithstanding, Britain was but the latest in a long line of strangers exercising their tyranny over the Iraqis. So by the time the people of Iraq heard President George W. Bush declare in 2003 that the United States had invaded Iraq to deliver its people from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein and to bring democracy to their country, they'd heard it all before. It was once again the wolf of occupation being dressed in the sheepskin of liberation. Now, given America's continued involvement in Iraq and the signs of democratic development as witnessed by yesterday's elections, I thought there would be no better country on which to focus this talk, which does take me a little bit far from, let's say, the Western Arab eyes than perhaps you'd intended, Roger. There is a deceptively positive gloss that the British put on their period of rule in Iraq. It was, in a sense, the successful mandate. The country had been occupied in the course of the First World War. The British then brought a popular king to the throne in the son of the Sharif of Mecca, Faisal ibn Hussein, who becomes Faisal I of Iraq. They oversee the drafting and approval of a constitution for the country, which is then given democratic means for electing representatives of the country for a parliament. So you have a constitutional parliamentary monarchy, not so different from the Westminster model, as the institutions of statecraft that would guide Iraq into independence. By 1930, Iraq's political development was so advanced that the British were willing to exchange direct rule through mandate to a treaty relationship, which in 1932 led to the independence of Iraq and its admissions to the League of Nations. The only mandate in the history of the League of Nations to actually gain independence and join the League. Other countries like Egypt joined the League shortly thereafter, but it had not been a mandate. So this was, in every sense, Britain's most successful mandate. Or was it? I think when one begins to examine the period of the mandate from Iraqi sources, one gets a very different reading of modern Iraqi history. Go back to the aftermath of Maud's proclamation. The Iraqis were hugely reassured by the Anglo-French declaration of November 1918, when people in the Arab world were already beginning to get concerned about what the Europeans' intentions might be towards the post-Ottoman Arab world. At that time, the British and the French came together to promise Allied support for, and I quote, the establishment of national governments and administrations in the Arab lands through a process of self-determination. Again, in this, they were paying lip service to the ideas from which the founder of this center was first responsible for drafting, the whole notion of national self-determination being one of the Wilsonian principles enshrined in the 14 points. That declaration, the Anglo-French declaration, was widely reported in the Iraqi press of the time. Al-Istiqlal, a newspaper in Basra, noted, the two states, Britain and France, delighted us with their statement of intention to assist us towards complete independence and freedom. But the Iraqis grew increasingly suspicious as the British failed to live up to their promises. And when a group of Iraqis approached the British with a request to send a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference to put forward their national claims, they were outright refused, just as the British had refused Saad Zaghloul when he made a similar demand to represent Egyptian aspirations. The Iraqis watched how Britain responded to the Egyptian Nationalist Uprising in 1919, which followed Zaghloul's appeal being turned down. They watched how Britain abandoned their ally Faisal, who was then king of Damascus, after the Arab revolt had led to the occupation of Damascus by Sharifian forces. They abandoned Faisal to the French in 1920, and ultimately Faisal would be turfed out by July 1920. And their suspicions were confirmed in April of 1920, when the League of Nations assigned Iraq to Britain as a formal mandate. The first public demonstrations against the mandate followed the following month in May 1920, which brought together Shiite clerics, tribal leaders, and members of nationalist organizations. The British, no doubt influenced by their experiences in Egypt, where nationalist demonstrations very rapidly turned into a kind of nationwide uprising that was very difficult to try and contain, responded very quickly with a swift crackdown to try and nip this early nationalist expression from the Iraqis in the bud. But the repression only served to drive the Iraqi movement out of the capital city into provincial towns particularly in the middle Euphrates. By the end of June 1920, Iraq erupted in a nationalist uprising that took place in many different centers. For the British, this meant a massive expansion in their troop presence from 60,000 to 100,000. We could call it the first surge in Iraq's history, and went to work with the reconquest of the country. A journalist in the Shiite shrine city of Najaf described the British onslaught. He wrote, "They attacked the houses of tribal sheikhs and burned them down, contents and all. They killed many men, horses, and livestock. The officers, i.e. the British officers, had no other interest in our extermination or putting us on trial. In recent days, there has been bloodshed and the destruction of populous towns and the violation of the sanctity of places of worship to make humanity weep." Now, the Iraqi Uprising of 1920 was finally put down by the British by the end of October. According to British estimates, this led to about 8,500 Iraqi casualties. The British suffered 2,200 British and Indian soldiers killed and wounded in that conflict. We have no idea what the Iraqi estimates of that conflict would be. And we have no idea what the material losses of that conflict were. Now, whereas we in the West have very little knowledge of the Iraqi uprising of 1920, this is something which is taught to school children in Iraq as part of their national history. The centers of that uprising, places like Najaf and Baquba and Fallujah, have the kind of resonance of a Concord or Lexington as places where Iraqis stood up to withstand outside oppression. So again, when Americans found themselves engaging in places like Fallujah and Baquba, they were new names to us, but they were names that had quite a resonance for resistance to outside oppression to the Iraqis, which is, again, a part of coming to terms with the present relevance of history. Now, the uprising of 1920 defeated, the Iraqis were still not reconciled to the British presence in their country. They continued opposition through the remaining years of the mandate almost without let-up. This opposition would make itself felt through the installation of Britain's wartime ally, King Faisal, as the first king of Iraq. Now, to be fair, I think that Faisal did enjoy widespread support among certain parts of the Iraqi population, particularly among those Sunni military officers who had served with him in the Arab Revolt and provided for him a very important support base within Iraq. Even without Britain's extensive assistance, he probably could have enjoyed a winning majority in a referendum to be crowned Iraq's first king. But Faisal had to prove himself to his many diverse Iraqi subjects. And it was what they really wanted was their independence. And it was that they expected Faisal to deliver to them. Muhammad Mahdi Qubba was a schoolboy in a Shiite theological seminary in one of the suburbs of Baghdad at the time when Faisal was crowned. He remembered when Faisal came to his school to receive the bay'ah, or the oath of allegiance, of the leader of the school, an Ayatollah by the name of Mahdi al-Khalisi, a very influential Shiite cleric in 1920s Iraq. As Qubba recalled in his memoirs, Khalisi said prayers for King Faisal and took him by the hand, saying, "We give you our allegiance as King of Iraq, so long as you govern with justice, that the government is constitutional and parliamentary, and that you do not entangle Iraq in any foreign commitments." Faisal promised to do his best and said he'd only come to Iraq to serve its people. But he must have known that he was in no position to avoid foreign entanglements, certainly not from Britain's influence. It was, after all, the British who had installed him as king, and he knew from bitter experience of Damascus 1920 how easily an imperial power could dispose of an inconvenient king. So his dependence on the British was manifest to Faisal. And so his limits in providing the independence the Iraqis expected was also manifest. Faisal's predicament became apparent already in 1922 when Britain drafted a treaty to try and regularize its position in Iraq. The Anglo-Iraqi Treaty scarcely veiled the degree of British domination over the Hashemite kingdom, in the economy, in diplomacy, and in the law. And the treaty was to last for 20 years. The treaty was widely condemned by Iraqi nationalists as a formula for extended British rule, not for expanding the domain of Iraqi independence. Faisal's Council of Ministers refused to take responsibility for such a controversial document and pressed the British to allow them to convene a constitutional constituent assembly to ratify this treaty. The British agreed to the request, but wanted to ensure that the resulting assembly would be one that would ratify their treaty. Nationalist politicians opposed both the treaty and the elections, recognizing that the Constituent Assembly would serve only to rubber stamp an agreement designed to perpetuate British control. Now, inevitably, King Faisal's credibility was compromised by the treaty crisis. We go back to Ayatollah al-Khalisi from the Theological Seminary in the Baghdad suburb, who assembled his students once again for another meeting. He said, "We gave our allegiance to Faisal to be king of Iraq on condition, and he failed to fulfill these conditions. Consequently, neither we nor the Iraqi people owe him any allegiance." Khalisi began to issue religious legal rulings or fatwas, declaring the treaty unlawful and forbidding all participation in the Constituent Assembly, banning Iraqis from either standing for the Assembly or for voting for the Assembly, as acts that would be tantamount to an act against religion as a step that assisted non-believers to rule over Muslims. Again, this is the language of one of his fatwas. In the end, the British had to impose their treaty by force. The British authorities prohibited all demonstrations, and Khalisi and other opposition leaders were arrested and exiled. The Royal Air Force was dispatched to bomb tribal insurgents again in the Middle Euphrates region who had risen in protest, and then the elections were held. The Constituent Assembly elected, and the treaty ratified in October 1924 by a very slim majority. The means used by the British to get the treaty passed tainted the instruments of constitutional and parliamentary government with imperial associations that I argue would ultimately undermine the respect for democracy in Iraq. This would be a very negative legacy of Britain's attempt to build democratic institutions, that they had to be imposed through such forceful means. Obviously, they did not have the courage of their convictions to let the institutions stand on their own merits and to let opposition take such shape as it would. And so by imposing parliamentary constitutional instruments by this means, I would argue that the British, in this first experiment with democracy in Iraq, had gone a long way to undermine people's confidence in democratic institutions. For the British, the cost of maintaining order soon began to exceed the benefits of trying to perpetuate their mandate over Iraq. In 1930, the British reassessed their position. They'd secured their interests in Mesopotamian oil by the 1928 Red Line Agreement, which gave Britain a 47.5% share in the Turkish or Iraq Petroleum Company. This was twice what the French and the Americans got. They only got a 23.75% share in the IPC. They had established a friendly, independent government in Iraq, headed by a reliable king, to protect British interests. British officials in Iraq, though, came to the conclusion that they would better assure their strategic interests by treaty than by continued direct control. And that's the background to the 1930 treaty, concluded in June of that year with the government of Iraq to replace the controversial 1922 treaty. Though nominally conferring independence on Iraq and declaring the mandate at an end, the new Anglo-Iraqi instrument stipulated that Britain's ambassador would enjoy preeminence among all foreign representatives in Iraq. The RAF would retain 2 air bases in Iraq, and British troops would be assured transit rights through the country. The Iraqi military would be reliant on Britain for all military hardware and for training. This was not full independence, but it was independence enough to secure Iraq's admission to the League of Nations, as we've already noted. Iraqi nationalists were persuaded to accept this treaty as a step in the right direction and in diminishing the degree of Britain's political rights over Iraq. But it was still a very long walk from the full freedom to which they aspired. The false independence in 1932 left Britain with base rights and undue influence over Iraq's military and foreign affairs. Now, these issues really came to the fore the height of the Second World War, the episode referred to as the Rashid Ali Coup in May of 1941. Rashid Ali was a military man who became prime minister, whose pro-Axis leanings and militant positions caused such discomfort to the unpopular regent ruling Iraq, Abdullah, that he took flight from the country. Rashid Ali, by continuing to exercise authority in the absence of the Hashemite monarchy, was deemed by the British to constitute a coup. His government was no longer recognized as legitimate by the British. And his pro-Axis leanings were deemed a strategic threat to Britain's position in the Middle East, which of course it was. And Britain's concerns here were quite legitimate and quite real. But their reaction was to demand the right to land troops in their bases in Iraq, rights which had been conferred on them by treaty agreement. Rashid Ali and his government, not trusting Britain's intention if they were to flood troops into the country, threatened to shoot down any British aircraft that might approach the bases. The British said this would be casus belli, so the two parties found themselves at loggerheads where really no one had room to back down. And this led to Britain and the government of Iraq essentially going to war in May of 1941. The Iraqis claiming to represent national interests, the British complaining, upholding the interests of the Western world in fighting Nazism. And the defeat of the Rashid Ali movement, in Western eyes, was seen as really the defeat of Nazi interests in the Middle East. But to Arab eyes, the British intervention demonstrated that nominally independent Iraq was still in a colonial situation, and that the unpopular British had to once again impose by force what they could not persuade the Iraqi people to accept. There were to be further milestones in the souring of the Anglo-Iraqi relationship. In 1948, as the British tried to renegotiate their treaty relationship with Britain, the whole notion of a new treaty extending formal ties between Britain and Iraq was so unpopular with Iraqi nationalists that the project had to be abandoned, particularly when the treaty was stipulated another 20-year commitment to Great Britain. In 1955, the Baghdad Pact, now at the height of the Cold War, was designed to contain the spread of communism from reaching the northern tier states of the Middle East. Signed in Baghdad, Pakistan, and Turkey, it was widely rejected across the Arab world, seen as a means to sanction a continued Western military presence in the Arab world, as a way not just of containing the spread of communism, but it was widely seen as a way of containing the threat of Arab nationalism, and particularly that virulent form of Arab nationalism which was seen to be emerging in Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser. And I suppose the last milestone and the breakdown in the Anglo-Iraqi relationship was, of course, the 1958 revolution, when King Faisal II, his much disliked uncle, the regent Abdullah, the Anglophile Prime Minister Nouri Said, were overturned in a violent, bloody coup in July 1958 that basically shattered every political institution that the British had installed in Iraq since 1920. It was no coincidence that on the 14th of July, 1958. The crowd attacked the statues of General Maud, come to liberate the Iraqis from the tyranny of strangers, of King Faisal I, who had been installed by the British as the first Hashemite monarch of Iraq, and that they set fire to the British chancellery in Iraq, in Baghdad on that day. Interestingly, the survivors of the Ancien Regime were rounded up by the free officers, headed by Abdul Karim Qasim, and taken off to a disused hospital, now converted to a prison that was known as Abu Ghuraib. It was to stay a prison. What lessons can we take from this brief survey of Iraq's history and of Anglo-Iraqi relations as seen through Arab eyes? Well, firstly, there should have been more of a sense of Iraq's suspicion of foreign domination that would have made British and American war planners more cautious on how foreign troops would be received. The notion that Saddam was so unpopular that foreign troops would be seen as liberators, in the light of Iraq's modern history, was not likely. And it's a kind of historic lesson that one might be well advised to take on board. Again, it's easy to say with hindsight, and I don't mean to try and sound all-seeing, because we're all looking back on events. But I think that is the kind of example or a lesson one might draw. Secondly, I think the government institutions, for them to be recognized as legitimate by their people and to prove enduring, need to be free from outside influence. The convening of a transitional National Assembly in January 2005 to draft and approve an Iraqi constitution, largely under American tutelage, raised real concerns among many Iraq experts, as in some ways repeating that experiment of trying to bring a constituent assembly together to approve an unpopular Iraqi treaty and to assist with the development of constitutional and parliamentary rule. The need to proceed very carefully, not to undermine the new political institutions in Iraq by association with this occupation, which is hopefully now coming close to its end, is, I think, a lesson that we need to take on board now, if we are not to provoke a widespread rejection of the institutions of the newly democratic state of Iraq, such as we witnessed when the Iraqis turned on the institutions installed by the British in their 1958 revolution. I can imagine the American government, as it withdraws its troops, allowing the Iraqi government a freer hand to rule itself than the British exercised. But there's one other area where I think that the Americans are going to have to show a restraint which until now they have not shown, which is in the role of American contractors in Iraq. I think that America cannot try to seek any undue privilege for U.S. contractors in Iraq, lest it look too much like the kind of exercise of undue privilege that the British exercised in Iraq in their heyday in the country. In short, the U.S. and its allies need to recognize the full independence and freedom of decision-making by the democratic government of Iraq. Any effort to try and encourage a sympathetic government in Iraq, a supportive government in Iraq, will ultimately discredit and delegitimize that government in the eyes of the Iraqi people. And I would argue, could be a harbinger of a revolution yet to come. I think the United States must accept that in many ways Iraq is now going to go its own way as American troops leave. And there will be times when Iraqis will elect parties that are hostile to the United States, or to the values of the United States, or to the interests of the United States. But I think it's going to be better for the United States to have, at times, cold relations with Iraq and see a stable Iraq survive with its new institutions and its democratic institutions, than to see Iraq go down the path of political instability that might ultimately lead it once again to looking like it's in risk of becoming a failed state. So better a stable and secure Iraq with institutions that reflect the will of its people, even if that country is not always going to elect people that like the United States, than to try and massage the process to generate the kinds of governments that we're comfortable with. If allowed to go its own way by a U.S. government that is truly guided, in the catchphrase of President Obama, by mutual interests and mutual respect, in time I think the Iraqis might actually come to credit the United States for helping the country to establish institutions of a stable democracy after decades of the tyranny of Saddam Hussein. But to get there, Americans need to learn their history, especially as history has been experienced and remembered by the other side, if they're to avoid making historic mistakes. Thank you very much.
Eugene, to get the discussion going, I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of questions about the concluding points. Let me return to the large claim that you made at the very beginning, that it's the first decade of the 20th century that manifests the greatest tension in all of Arab history between the West and the Arabs. It may well be right, but I would have thought that there was a minor claim, at least to be made, for the 1940s and the 1950s. The 1940s because of the creation, obviously, of the State of Israel, the 1950s Suez, along with the Iraqi Revolution.
Thank you, Roger. Well, whenever I'm talking to you about the 1940s and 1950s, I'm walking with trepidation. In writing the book, I came up with a framework. You want to write 5 centuries about modern history, you need a framework. And my framework was this notion that one of the distinctive features of modern Arab history is that they have had to navigate the modern world by other people's rules. And that framework gave me a period where the rules were made in Istanbul, we'll call that the Ottoman period, where they were made in London and Paris, and we'll call that the Imperial period. And then the Cold War was when they were made in Moscow and Washington. And around 1990, Moscow falls out. We come into a post-Cold War era. I would say around the time of the Kuwait War, when Moscow for the first time falls in behind American Middle East policy, really. And then it's been a unipolar world since then. And the reason why I would say that the first decade of the 21st century was even worse than, let's say, the period after the Palestine War, the Suez Crisis, is because for the first time the Arabs didn't have any countervailing power to try and play against the dominant power of the age. They were faced with unbridled American force, with no other power that could contain it. And that, to me, is the big difference between that moment and the 40s and 50s. The specter of mutual destruction through thermonuclear war was a break that exercised real restraint on both the Soviets and the Americans through the years of the Cold War. And it's something that the Arabs, by their own acknowledgement, were aware of, and they used to try and sort of make the most of their power. They would play the Soviets against the Americans, or the Americans against the Soviets. And with the loss of the Soviet Union, and the fact that there was no power now to exercise a veto over the United States in the Security Council, or to stop America from sending an invasion army into the region, something that America could never have done as long as the Soviet Union was exercising influence over the region, meant, I think, that they were more vulnerable, more exposed, and more afraid. And that's why I think that that decade was the period of greatest tension.
Very interesting. Sonia?
Yeah, very, very interesting. But I have a question about your periodization. You only mentioned Saddam Hussein at the very end, and so your account of modern or recent Iraqi history is somewhat truncated. And it seems to me that you would have to take into account, I mean, I know nothing about this, but I mean, it seems to me you would need to take into account the history of the Ba'athist regime to fully understand the Iraqis' response to the U.S., because otherwise it's as if the only history they're remembering is one from, the pre-Ba'athist period, and there's obviously something happened in between. I'm not condoning the invasion or anything else, but I just wonder, what if you take that into account, how does that change your explanation?
Excellent question. And I think in understanding the host of issues that America faced and Britain faced when they actually invaded Iraq, then the history of the Ba'athist regime is absolutely critical. The distinction I would make is this. What I'm interested in is how the Iraqis responded to foreign intervention. And that's why stopping at 1958 made sense, because it was such a rupture with their relations with the British, who since 1920, well, since 1917, had played such a critical role. And what happened after that were the actions and mistakes or tyrannies of Iraqis on Iraqis, in which their status as an independent state in the state system was recognized, and which led them to enter into very close relations with the USSR, which lasted until about 1980, when actually they began to enter into really close relations, supply relations, with Western powers like France, and eventually with the United States. And so, in that sense, their relations with the international world have been colored very much by their places, their role as a supplier of oil, their role as a consumer of expensive products that Western countries are pleased to sell them, but not as a foreign domination scenario. And that's why my point of reference was the British passed up to 1958. But no, obviously for Americans invading, not only would they need to know the history of what had gone on under British rule, but also what had gone on in the periods since the revolution, and specifically the changing nature of America's engagement with Iraq, which was something they were also criticized for. They not been constant there.
But I mean, wasn't there, if I can just follow up, I mean, wasn't there perception of the Americans, entry, liberation, whatever, whether it was regarded as a liberation or not? I mean, they weren't, in other words, they weren't only responding to the U.S. as an invader or as a sort of a continuation of earlier domination, but they were also responding from their experience of being under the Ba'athist regime. I mean, in other words, were there no Iraqis who were glad to have somebody, have a countervailing force to the Ba'athist regime?
There were a lot of Iraqis who were thrilled to bits to see the Americans come in and topple Saddam. It was too good to be believed, I think, in the opening months. I think that for many Iraqis, it really became a concrete reality only in December of 2003 with the capture of Saddam Hussein, after his two sons had been killed in a gunfight. And then they really could believe that it was over and that there would not be a restoration. And yes, I think there were many parties in Iraq that were happy, but they're not necessarily the parties that America was sympathetic to or were sympathetic to America. And I think in very recent years, America had done a lot to cause bad feeling with different parts of Iraqis. I think that the Kurds and Shiites both felt very let down that when President George H.W. Bush had encouraged uprising against Saddam, and they did so, they were left to suffer the consequences without America intervening on their behalf. And the Sunnis were very opposed to America coming in because Sunnis had been those closest to the regime of Saddam Hussein and stood to lose the most. So in a funny sort of way, though many were glad to see Saddam out and to have that lifted from them, it wasn't necessarily a formula that led them to like America. And they were very unsure about where America was going with their resources, with their future, with their country. So it was a problematic relationship. And there had been, years of America leading sanctions against Iraq. There had been the Kuwait war driving Iraqis out. There had been, the whole use of force against Iraqi troops withdrawing from Kuwait, which many believe were retreating forces. The Iraqis took this very badly. So there is a history there of great antagonism between Iraq and the United States, which is part of the story under the Mafia years. Complicated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sam Wells.
Dr. Rogan, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I'd like you to comment briefly, if you can, on the held lessons by Iraqis of earlier invaders, to wit, the Turks and the Iranians.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not the right person to answer it. It's true that for a good part of the Ottoman centuries, a lot of Mesopotamia was a real punching bag between rival Turkish and Persian empires. And really the kind of three province of Mesopotamia, Mosul, Baghdad, Basra, under Ottoman rule, is really a late 18th century phenomenon. Until then, I think it was a conflict zone that that had meant that the provinces were left more or less to their own devices and quite remote from the Ottomans themselves, right down to the end of Ottoman rule. These were not central to the Ottoman state. And you'll find that civil servants, I came across some orders in the Ottoman archives, dispatching a functionary, a district governor, to Mosul. And in his response, he graphically said, "Please send me to the deepest pit of hell before you send me to Mosul." So you don't have the sense that these were places that were deeply integrated to the Ottoman system until quite late. The 1880s, 1890s, where you see the real expansion of Ottoman infrastructure, schools being opened, railways being laid. The Ottomans are trying to extend their presence in the Persian Gulf region to rival the British by trying to link Kuwait to their province in Basra, by trying to establish a kind of position in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, Hassa, in Qatar. But these were all overextended initiatives that never really led to a sort of close integration of either Mesopotamia or the Gulf regions under Ottoman rule. And I think the real expert would be my colleague Nina Houri at George Washington, who could give you far more about the conflict zone between Persians and Ottomans there. But my reflections would be limited to those. Yes.
First of all, I didn't tell you who I am. Dr. Ali Al-Amri. I'm working now for the International Health Division for the DOD. I was the deputy of the Iraqi Surgeon General until 9 months ago. I was in the old Iraqi army and the new Iraqi army until 9 months ago.
I'm glad you didn't tell me who you were beforehand, or I wouldn't have dared say anything.
I've been following you for each statement that you said, sir.
Uh-oh.
About that question of the conflict in Iraq, it was since 1258, after the Abbasi Empire has fallen by the Mongols from mid-Asia. Iraq was in a conflict between Iran and Turkey, and there was kind of a bloody war each nearly 50 years. Because Iran considered Iraq as a part of it. If you just look to the map of Iraq, the capital of Iran, which is Al-Madain, is northern to Baghdad. Iraq was part of Iran for more than 2,000 years. And I think in understanding the whole situation of Iraq, definitely we have to consider the influence of Iran in Iraq. I mean, that have to be very well studied and understood, because Iran is still having the biggest influence in Iraq and on the Shia. The picture that could be seen is that the Shia of Iraq are somehow related to Iran. That's not true, because mostly Iraqis consider Iran that it's their enemy, which is actually right. It's their enemy. That's number one. Number two, I think to understand the whole picture about the situation in Iraq, we have to understand the situation of the Kurds in the northern of Iraq and their dream of having the Kurdish country, part of Iran, part of Turkey, part of Syria, and part of Iraq. And their influence on the governments of Iraq since King Faisal and Abdul Karim Qasim and even the last regime. They've been in conflicts with the governments, and they've been in many insurgencies against the governments. Of the persons who have great influence on Iraq was Nouri al-Said, which was a general in the Ottoman Empire, and he has been a prime minister in Iraq for about 7 times from 1920 until 1958. He's one of the key persons in Iraq and in the whole region. Another very important thing is that Jamal Abdel Nasser, first of all, let us speak about the Arab countries. The Arab countries, there is no thing called Arab countries. We always say Arab countries, Arab countries. What joins those countries actually is, maybe you can say, the Islam. It's not so right to say the Arab countries. And
we can disagree on that one. There's more to it than just Islam. I think Islam's a very big part of it, but there's much more to it than that.
If we are speaking about Arab country, you have the people, the Arabs from the North Africa, you have the Egyptians, and you have the people from the Arabic Peninsula. Each differs in their origins, and even they don't speak the same Arabic language. I mean, the person from the Arabic Peninsula definitely won't understand those people from North Africa. Anyhow, Jamal Abdel Nasser, by the 40s of the last century, he meant that idea of speaking about the Arabic nationality, and when he did that, when he made that military government of him over the kingdom in Egypt, he started those revolutions in all the Arab countries. One of that was the Al-Ba'ath Party, which believes in that Arabic nationality, which is not so quite. I think we have to speak more about that, whether it's an Islamic or Arabic countries.
Well, we'll keep that between us. And is there any question? Because I mean, your comment. No. I mean, I appreciate your comments, and it'd be pretty stupid for an author of Arab history to be trying to silence an Arab view on Arab history. But I mean, is there a question in particular you wanted me to address?
If you want to speak about the Islam, about Iraq, let's say about Iraq, you are speaking about Iraq or Arab countries?
In my book, in my talk, or
yes.
in my answer to you?
In your book.
Oh, it's about the Arab world more generally, about the Maghrib, the Mashriq, and the Khalij.
Oh.
Eugene, he did raise the question about the Kurds.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Do you think that the Kurds have some influence, because that issue is not only limited to Iraq, because they try also to do something in Syria? I think you definitely know about that.
Well, again, as you know, the Kurds are the neglected nation of the Versailles, one of the neglected nations of the Versailles process. They were supposed to be a Kurdistan, and you're right in its geographic reach. The history of the 20th century has put paid to those hopes. There is, I think, absolutely no prospect of trying to reconstitute the Kurdish homeland of Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And what happens to the Kurds within the confines of Iraq is still an open question. Their future as an independent state would be one of great danger, because they would be surrounded by countries that were distrustful of them, and they would find themselves in conflict over the sharing of Iraqi resources, particularly oil resources. So in a funny way, I think, though they are well down the road towards independent nationhood in terms of national identity and in terms of the institutions of statecraft. They have their own parliament, they have their own regional government, with cabinet ministers and with their own budget line. They have universities in which they teach Kurdish language, and they're going in every sense of the word independent. But it may be in their interest for the foreseeable future to be independent within an Iraqi state, to have a de facto federalism, even if it's not recognized constitutionally, just so that they will continue to enjoy the protection of the Iraqi state, the international community, which might be denied them were they to be independent Kurdistan facing Turkey on one side, Syria on the other, Iraq on the other, and the Iranians.
Iran, exactly.
Which, frankly, if I were looking to be independent, those are not the neighbors that I would choose.
Exactly.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Kathleen Friedel. I want to take some elements of the questions that have already been asked and take them to, I guess, a different level of abstraction, which is, can you tell me more about the historically salient features of what it means to be an Iraqi nationalist, and how that changes from, say, 1922 to, as Sonia was saying, a kind of Ba'athist or post-Ba'athist nationalist? Because it seems to me there are different elements in motion that are very, very fluid, and I understand that there's a centuries-old rivalry with Iran in play. There's a kind of younger vintage of rivalry with the Ottoman Empire. How do we define an Iraqi nationalist and what it means to be an Iraqi nationalist? And I know that that's a difficult question, so actually, just to build on the comments that were just made, how do different ethnic and religious divisions give us leverage into defining who and what an Iraqi nationalist is?
Couldn't ask a more relevant question, as Iraq is going into this new era in its own history, and while it's trying to negotiate power sharing by different communities who have come through the 20th century history of Iraq and the Ottoman history of Iraq with certain expectations. I mean, the most obvious case here is how do you ensure that Sunnis, who are used to being the political elites of Iraq, see that they have a vested interest or a stake in a democratic Iraq where communities that are larger in demographic terms are going to enjoy more of a say. And how well then does the center hold? If the center is the identity of a unified Iraq that is a state of all of its people, then how does that hold? Here maybe history has less to offer us than what evolution will come from this new phase in Iraq's history. The history of Iraq tells us that there has been, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, a fruitful period of political diversity that's often overlooked by our assumption that Iraq has been a monolithic Ba'athist state from the very outset. I have a colleague with us at Oxford named Fulat Hadid, whose father was Mohammed Hadid, who was one of the sort of founders and driving forces of the National Democratic Party. So I have had my tutorials for years now from the son of the founder of the NDP on Iraq's homegrown Democrats. And these are graduates of the LSE and the University of London who were convinced Latskyites and, had taken their political philosophy from liberal European thought, from socialists, and came back to try and reform what they saw as being wrong with the constitutional monarchy. They were Democrats. They thought that the problems with Iraq lay not in its multi-sectarian or confessional nature, but in its political system that favored a small group of elites against the nation as a whole. They were committed secularists. And they saw through secularism a way to transcend sectarian divisions. And so Iraqis of this stripe, and they're all in their 50s, 60s, and 70s now, but they will remind me of, how many, prime ministers have been Shiites or Kurds, cross marriages, how they were in the interest of an Iraqi national identity, transcending all of that. What happened, I think, in the Ba'ath years was that notion got hijacked by Baathism. And what became the dominant identifying factor of your allegiance to Iraq was not a belief in a common national purpose that transcended sectarian divides, but whether you were a card-carrying member or not. And that those who weren't were excluded, those who were privileged, and that created the inequalities and the tensions, which I think have been tearing Iraq apart, and came to the fore in 1990, and then again after 2003. And there I think history will serve us very little to answer your question of what is an Iraqi nationalist today. I think it's going to look quite different from what history had shown us it to be. And I think that there will be new parties that will play a very key role in shaping that. I think Islamic parties are going to be a very big part of that, but not exclusively. I don't think Ayad Alawi is totally in the wilderness when he speaks to the appeal of secularism in Iraq today. I think that for many people across the Arab world, secularism is still a very important shared value, even in this Islamically important political era. Sorry for the waffle, but I think your question's very and watch this spawn.
Eugene is picking up from other comments. Is there an enduring legacy of Nuri Said? Or have things just changed so drastically that it could be considered negligible?
I can't think of any enduring legacy of Nuri Said. I mean, can you, Roger? This is really
well,
close to
he was
your...
trying to define a sense of Iraqi nationalism, and so that, I think, connects with your... it's a different type of nationalism.
It is, and it was a nationalism that was very much within the context of the monarchy. And again, as we were saying, of transcending sectarian divisions and trying to bind Iraqis through a common purpose. It's very interesting because there are a lot of Iraqis in Britain. Iraqis who have been, in Britain for decades. Many of them are exiles, and many were active in the INC, and a lot of them come around the Middle East Center in Oxford. And very hard to get two Iraqis to agree with each other. They argue about everything, about their history, their present, and their future. And I find it quite striking to hear the royalists, for whom that period before '58 was the best period that Iraq ever knew. And those who see themselves as the progressive camp, for whom it was just too regressive, it was too retrograde, the monarchy. And these are still dynamics at work in Iraqi society today, and in the political elites today, and I think that the issue is still open. But it's hard to see any of those who were associated with that period when Britain was a dominant world power, having influence over where things would be going today, an enduring legacy in that sense. I can't think of one.
Sherry?
Professor Rogan, do you think that the institutions that have been designed under the American occupation with Americans and international experts on constitutions reflect the needs of the Iraqi people, and are they viewed positively from best as you can tell?
I really don't know. I think that's one that time will tell. I think it's a great development that people turned out, in spite of the threat of violence, to cast their votes. They're not doing that to please the Americans. They've got to be doing it because it reflects their idea that this is how they express their will over who their rulers will be. That people will stand for office. It's a dangerous thing to stand for office. It's a dangerous thing to take up government in Iraq. And people are willing to do this. And so in those ways, the signs look actually kind of positive. But it's very hard to know it from our sources. I read Western newspapers. And I think Americans and Britons really want to see a solution in Iraq that will allow us to withdraw and leave the Iraqis to it. And I think that we might overlook some of the messier sides of what's going on now in that objective. But I do think we're past having a positive contribution to make in Iraq. And that's why I keep saying, I mean, I hope that these institutions seem to be ones that work. And I hope that we give them enough space to work on their own so that the Iraqis can claim them as they're claiming the polling booths they did so yesterday.
Hope you're right.
I hope so too.
Steve Galper.
Thank you. No, thanks. There is a long memory in the Middle East. I was shocked, frankly, last June when there was the resistance, the results of the election in Iran, when the leadership referred back to the British, especially given the U.S. presence informally since then. When you mentioned Britain securing bases in Iraq, how much, when you looked at the Arabic language press in Iraq, how much discussion was there in talk of U.S. bases in Iraq? Oh, here we go again. I remember, or we studied this, or I remember that. Going back to the British. Here is a repetition of everything that we've seen before. This is just a new guise.
You know, I don't recall seeing things in the Iraqi press that I could quote offhand, and I don't want to misrepresent my reading of current affairs to suit the convenience of my lecture. So I'm going to plead ignorant. The one thing I will say is that before the Bush administration came to a close, they were determined to conclude a treaty with the Iraqi government to validate the presence of American troops in Iraq. And that was something that was very sound in international legal terms, why they would want to do so. But it was precisely the kind of initiative which sounded like concluding a treaty to provide for base rights that made my Iraqi interlocutors see red, and made them bring up once again the historical precedents of the British bases. And what really worried them most was this awareness that where the Americans have established bases in the world in the past, they've tended to stay. You know, our bases in Japan or the Philippines or in Europe, these are bases that have been there for decades. And so the real concern was if once the, let's say, American Air Force, the American Army, puts down roots, it's very hard to pick them up and move them again. And this was why it was so important that President Obama's message from the very beginning of his presidency was of a drive to withdraw all American troops, and in the foreseeable future. Obviously, that's got to be done in a responsible way, in a reasonable way, both for the needs of the American military and for those who are providing for the security of the Iraqi government, so you don't leave a power vacuum that means it all collapses like a house of cards. But that message that message by itself went such a long way to de-escalating some of the tensions I was talking about in this first decade of the 21st century. Because one of the abiding fears, I think, in the Arab world was that there would be a permanent American military presence in the Arab world that would exercise undue influence or control over the affairs of the region. And even with the American withdrawal from Iraq, there will remain CENTCOM in Qatar, a very large naval presence in Bahrain. So the American bases are still there to deal with, and I'm sure that those will come under focus in the near future as the need for them as a support base for troops in Iraq is eliminated. Then what are they doing there? And how long will they be tolerated? And to what degree do they destabilize their host governments? For the moment it seems okay, but I don't know how long that will last.
Colonel Dow represents the United States Army in this seminar.
I'm retired, so I think there are some people here from the United States Army that refute that. But I have a number of questions. I'm just going to really go with one, or try to keep it at one. The book is about the Arab world. I'm a little confused because we keep focusing on Iraq, and I don't think you can express the Arab world through Iraq. You know, I agree with that. And I'll just say I don't agree with your opening statement that this last decade was the most contentious. I would modify it to that maybe it was the decade that several decades of frustration were expressed by the Arabs. And my point being was, or after 9/11, I believe the Arab world psychologically crossed a threshold where before the U.S. was untouchable in many ways. It was no longer impervious. And then later on, during the Iraq War, we conducted the war in a way where the U.S. showed that in many ways, boy, they're just like us in how they conduct war, in the nasty business of war. And so I would submit that instead of saying such an absolute statement, that again, maybe some of the curtains were lifted on what the Americans or what a country is about when it's in a world leadership role and how it exercises power. And perhaps how the Arabs perceive that instead. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think we can agree to disagree on some things. And I think that the perspectives we bring to the subject reflect the intelligence that we've had on our approach to the subject. I think that if one has military intelligence to bring to the study of the recent history of the region, it's a very, very rich and important way of approaching it that I don't have privy access to. And I think you know things I don't know. So I don't mean this lightly or as a get. I just think that because we come at it with different background knowledge, we may disagree on these things. I sort of explained why I saw that first decade as standing out as a period of tension, comparing it with the 40s and 50s. The war on terrorism was widely perceived to be a war on Islam by people in the Muslim world. And the Arab world felt itself at the nerve center. When axes of evil were being pronounced, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were isolated. Now, I mean, obviously Iran's not an Arab country, but it's in the neighborhood. There was a sense that that part of the world was in the crosshairs, as it never had been before, by the single most powerful state in human history. So that was a scary place to be. There was talk of regime change extending beyond the axis of evil so that countries like Syria were put on notice. What this meant for the exercise of government in Lebanon suddenly became an open question. It wasn't really clear where the use of military means would end. And I think that the Bush administration liked to keep all options on the table as a deterrence. There's obviously a limit to how many theaters you can be conducting war in without exhausting your troops and your resources. But there was in that decade a bigger threat of direct intervention or of regime change on more places around the Arab world and the Middle East than had been in the modern history of the region. I mean, if we want to go back to a precedent, you're right. We could find other decades that were pretty bad. For me, it would be in the 13th century, around the 1250s. You had a really bad moment when the Mongols came to town. And they did do serious damage to the Abbasid state And they made their way right through Syria, and they made their way right to Palestine before finally the Mamluks put a stop to it. And that's a period of serious tension because it destroyed institutions, it led to regime changes, it led to, military presence, it led to the kinds of tensions that, I think stand out in human history. But I surveyed 5 centuries with my own biased eyes. I don't in any way try to say I'm above all of this. I've been living in the Middle East off and on since 1970. So I've had a long time. I lived in Beirut, I lived in Cairo, I lived in Amman, and I've been traveling back and forth through the region, since the 1970s. So I've seen some pretty bad times. But that decade really stood out and maybe that's why my bias is that. Maybe I have brought my own experience too heavily to bear in reading the past 5 centuries of history. But I've never known a period of such anxiety and despair, a period of a sense of powerlessness against forces that could so ultimately reshape the way of life of people in the region. And that's why, to me, it stands out. But I could be wrong.
I was debating whether to ask, but your last statement kind of gave me a lead-in for it.
Okay.
My only familiarity with the area really derives from I've been reading a lot of English language Arab blogs, and one of the things that intrigues me, what I see in that, is a debate among the bloggers who tend, of course, to skew young and West. I can only read the English one, so they skew towards me. Thank you. But one of the threads that intrigues me in their use, kind of made reference to in your last remarks, and that is there's this general thread. The phrase that they're using is the failed generations. That there's this sort of sense of rejection of the grandfathers with Nasserism didn't work, the fathers with whatever we want to call jihadist terrorism, religious inspired. I mean, I don't want to get into a debate of that, but that kind of that doctrinally focused attempt. And there is a kind of thread there of at least a desire to stop defining and justifying the future based on the arguments of the past, going back to the 13th century. Now, I say this as an American who can barely remember last Tuesday, let alone still being able to live on an everyday real basis, something that happened in 1258. I can appreciate that, but I can't imagine it.
Right.
So I wonder whether do you see in this argument or this discussion about the future an ability or some way in breaking away from justifying the future based on redress of past ills?
It's not so alien from American experience. I probably have put my cards already on the table as something of a liberal-leaning Obama enthusiast, so I probably don't come across as one of these people. But I'm really struck by the Tea Party movement. What's that all about? That's going back to an 18th century precedent of Americans resisting taxation without representation, or government that no longer represents their values.
You're speaking in D.C. and I'm a D.C. resident, so I know this quite well.
Well, no, but I mean the point is, when the historic referent comes from our own history of resistance against outside oppression, it sticks. I say Lexington and Concord, and you're not asking what conflict that's relevant to. Because you've been taught it in school, and it's part of our culture, it's part of our upbringing, it's part of our identity as Americans. And I think every national group has such potent historical antecedents that even those that don't remember what happened last Tuesday, nonetheless will have a knee-jerk reaction to as just historical markers that are really part of our identity. And so we don't actually get away from those. It doesn't mean that we are trying to redress the past. It just means that there's something relevant about the past. And it comes back, I didn't answer the other part of your question, which is, no, I really don't mean to conflate the experience of Iraq with Arab history. And the only reason why I focus so much on Iraq in this lecture, I don't in the book, it's one part of the Arab world, was because I think in talking to American audiences about the present relevance of history, our involvement in Iraq today means that we're actually interested in the points of relevance in that experience to understand where we are now. So I biased my speech towards Iraq, but I think you can broaden that discussion out to the present relevance of history to our encounters with any other part of the Arab world or modern Arab history more generally.
we need to begin to draw this to a close. Could we ask for a last question or so? Would you mind if we collect a few?
No, I'd be delighted. I'll be very short in answering.
Ken, and then the question over here. And who else? And Red Austin will collect. Yes, Tom Dell. Any other questions? Okay.
It's on. In talking about Arab identity and Iraqi identity, you've alluded when you talked about the conflating of Israeli efforts against Hamas and Hezbollah and so on. But you haven't said much about Israel as a central, what seems to me a central part of modern Arab identity, or not so much Iraqi since it's occupied, but the rest of the Arab or Muslim or Islamic or however you define it, not only because of the war on terror, but this long abiding, enormously difficult problem of Israel. How do you see that as, I won't say soluble, we've already decided we can't do that, but how do you see that playing into a more stable Middle East or a more stable Iraq to stay where we are? Well, once it becomes independent, one of the obvious things it could do to really annoy America is become violently anti-Israel, which it hasn't had the freedom really to do so far.
Shall I continue maybe here?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Could you, Dieter Detke, Georgetown University, could you perhaps talk a little bit more about the overall picture, the image, the model of the West that you see emerge in Arab countries? Is it just what you talked about, occupation, military, all these features? Isn't there anything, I mean, not that we know much about the West, but isn't there anything like democracy, some values that must have some sort of an impact and effect? Is it there or is it not there? Is it just, this very distorted, in my view, image of the military, the occupation, the occupiers, the exploiters of Arab oil reserves and all that?
Tom Dell, and then, Red Austin, and then Tom Dell.
It doesn't seem to me that Americans in general, meaning the population that votes and joins tea parties and all that sort of thing, fully understand the psychological power of resentment. And for someone who's lived abroad quite a few years, I find it everywhere I go. And I am quite sympathetic to it in the sense that I think I understand where it's coming from. That doesn't mean that those admirable things about the United States, which various individuals define in their own various ways, are unseen. But it's like having a lot of clouds in the sky, and most of them are white, but the black clouds are very, very powerful.
I was going to ask, and it relates, I think, to all three questions. I've often thought possibly that the U.S. and we'll just say the Arab countries are operating on different planes. And if they are operating on different planes, one small example being our anti-communism operations could very well have been equated to anti-nationalism, in the 50s. So if that is in the history, can you really break that pattern for the future?
Anybody else?
One last question.
I've hesitated to ask it because it seems to be going off in an entirely different direction.
Go for it.
But I'm working on an article which has brought me to a much more central awareness of the widespread suicide terrorism in the Arab world, and not limited to the Arab world, but much more widespread in the Arab world than anywhere else. And I wonder if there's anything you might say on that
observation.
Well, that's a wide range of issues. Okay. Let's address this question about Israel's place and whether an independent Iraq, free of America, might become, particularly hostile to Israel. There's no escaping the need to resolve the differences between Israel and its neighbors. There is no escaping the fact that that will only be resolved by coming up with an equitable solution to Palestinian national aspirations. Israel actually did choose its neighborhood. When Zionism said, no, Uganda won't do, it's got to be Palestine, then it was coming into the Arab world. And so there would have to be some way of coming to mutual recognition. And actually, it's not so hard to see. It's not just the Abdullah Plan, which promises full normalization of relations between all Arab states and Israel in return for a full withdrawal from all territories occupied in 1967. It's a very tiny formula. It's a little hard to get there. But it's also the memory of recent history. I'm thinking of the Oslo years. How no sooner did the Palestinians and Israelis meet on the White House lawn than the Jordanians turned around and concluded a deal. The Moroccans and Tunisians opened halfway diplomatic relations. The Qataris and the Omanis opened economic offices. And the sort of Shimon Peres vision of a new Middle East integrated by infrastructural projects and whatnot was something that people in the Arab world were remarkably open to. So, to those who would argue that the Arabs cannot come to terms with Israel because of what Israel is, I would say, no, it is what Israel does. And the moment it stops doing what it does, it makes it so impossible to live with in the Arab world, then going to a resolution is going to be pretty simple. They can't build any more settlements. They can't keep that wall going. They're going to have to recognize the territory on one side of the green line is Israel, and the other side of it is being Palestine. It's not hard to get the Israelis to say where the green line is, because the moment you try and encroach beyond it, they'll tell you. So all the obfuscation out the window. I don't worry about Iraq becoming fervently anti-Israel. It's not their neighborhood. They got bigger fish to fry. But it's an Arab issue. It's one of those issues, we talk about what makes Arabs click. This one, you get an Arab-wide response to. But the further you go away from the conflict zone, North Africa on one hand, the Arabian Peninsula on the other, they're sick of it. They just want to see it solved. And we've got the terms under which to do it. So I think Israel's central. I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think the Arab world's going to go away. But what it takes to solve this one really requires the U.S. to act as an honest broker. Never done that before. It would be wonderful if it did. It has all the power to do so, which is not to say to force Israel to do things. It can't do that. It's a democracy. You've got to bring the Israeli people on board. But just by recognizing certain baselines of international law, like settlements are illegal, that would be really good. Just as a point of departure. But we've seen where the president's gotten with settlements, and maybe my suggestion isn't what he would listen to at this particular moment. Image of the West in Arab countries is much more diverse than just the notion of the imperial past. If I were talking in the 1960s, I'd say, no, the imperial past is all that matters, and that's all that shapes the image. What's really interesting is to see how many Arab states now have rather romantic attachments to their former imperial powers. I mean, I think that no country went through greater bloodshed and violence than did Algeria. And yet the Algerians still have quite a close trade and political relationship with the French. For the Moroccans and the Tunisians, it comes much easier. The access to European labor markets for their nationals is something very important to them. They wish to be more actively involved in the EU as an economic and trade network. And so they're very well aware of what they like about. I think that many people see the EU as a kind of global power manqué. It's not quite risen to it hasn't assumed its position in world power. It certainly doesn't have a political weight to match its economic weight. And for those who would like to see a countervailing force to unilateral American power, some hope for Europe to rise to that. I say don't hold your breath.
I don't think that Europe is going to behave in those ways. I think Europe is still very concerned to make sure it coordinates particularly big global issues with the United States. Its willingness to act independently of America on issues like the Arab-Israeli peace process, whatever, is zero. That's just not where they're going. But I think that there is certainly a separation of the notion of the West between Europe and America. And I think for many countries in the region who have become increasingly globalized, there's no hostility towards the West or its values. They embrace our commercial enterprises, our commercial values. I mean, I've just come back from Abu Dhabi. The malls there look so much like the malls here. You don't have the sense that these are people who are struggling against, the image of the West. They embrace it with both arms. It's not what we are, it's what we do. And if what we do seems to be impinging on their freedom or their independence, we get resentment. But if we have an attractive product to sell, we find very eager buyers there. The psyche of resentment. Yes, I mean, I think that that has a lot to do with the history of imperialism and those legacies that make people very upset, or of recent American actions in the war on terror and whatnot. No doubt there has been a certain overshadowing of what people respect. I mean, we have to remember, we're in the Wilson Center again. America's first real engagement with the outside world was a set of values pronounced by Woodrow Wilson. And they created an image of the United States and the rest of the world that we've never really lived up to. They saw the United States as a disinterested power that was going to bring the benefits of self-determination to the emerging countries of the rest of the world. But our isolationism meant we never really played that role in the interwar years. We left imperialism to do its thing. And when we did find ourselves in a position of global dominance or global influence during the Cold War and subsequently, then we have repeated mistakes of the imperialists in the eyes of the developing world, which has lost us affection and made people see more negative about us than good about us. But I'm always struck when I'm in the, and I get in the neck when I'm in the region. I mean, I only go with my American passport. It's all I've got. I don't pretend to be something else. I'm an American, and I get both barrels of their grievances against what America does in the region. So I hear a lot of this. And the psyche of resentment overshadowing the good of America is certainly there. But the generosity of people in the region to see the difference between us as individuals or what's good in our culture and what they dislike about what our government does is something that always strikes me and gives me hope. So I think that we still have a lot of goodwill on which to build, and a lot that we stand for in terms of our wonderful values and principles that people admire. And those are the strengths to which we must play if we're to win the hearts and minds. Yeah, I think that Americans and Arabs are often on different planes. I really, without any irony, I think that captures it. But we can't really work that way. We actually have to find a common plane of action. Because the United States has not written off the Middle East or the Arab world, it's there. And it's now something which has really done quite serious damage to our treasury and to our armed forces. And, so it's finding the common plane on which to work, which to me is why it's important to know their history. Try to understand why they're coming at it from where they do. That's the only, if I could contribute one little thing to the ideas pool that might be of use to our policymakers, it would just be that. And I think by seeing where people are coming from, we'll understand how to interact with them more constructively and try and find one plane on which we can operate together on issues of common interest, recognizing there will still be, since we're such different cultures, different planes on which we don't meet. And one of those is certainly suicide terror. Look, I'm totally puzzled by it. I can understand why somebody might be motivated to give their life to do something spectacular, to strike a blow that's going to cause great freedom to your people who've been oppressed. There are conditions under which people have, even in our culture, been willing to sacrifice their life to bring good to others. But when I watch the banality of suicide bombers in Iraq, week in, week out, people going and killing themselves to kill Iraqis in public markets. I have no idea what it is that motivates people to do that. So I don't have an answer for you. I've only got one historical antecedent, which was, you'll remember that there was an assassination attempt by the Muslim Brothers on Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1954. It was actually his moment of coming out of the stage as a national leader. Okay, the Muslim Brothers, when they wanted to plot this civil war, this according to Richard Mitchell, their first idea was they were going to strap some poor
volunteer with dynamite. And he was going to go on up and approach the president and detonate his bombs and kill himself and kill the president. And they sat around a table like this and they said, nah, not a good idea. So they sent a guy into the audience with a pistol and he shot at Nasser instead and missed. But obviously it was an idea that had not come of its time. But it would come of its time. And I don't really have any answers to explain what it is about its time.
Eugene, thank you.